it's interesting because I think part of it evolved through Bill covering the political conventions, and they got to know each other. But I did find in a letter.
So let me interrupt you for a minute. So
Sure.
when they first met, was that when he was still a senator?
Yeah, because he and George Smathers, who was the senator from South Florida, Kennedy and Smathers were good friends. And there were a couple of stories I know that Bill covered Smathers, and the Kennedy compound in Palm Beach. So he was frequently in South Florida. I found a letter though where right after Kennedy was elected, he came down to Palm Beach, and Bill was actually kind of summoned up to Palm Beach to give his impressions of what was happening in South Florida, and actually to provide advice on who were some people to consider for cabinet positions and things like that. There's nothing that is documenting the nature of their conversation. It's something Bill is mentioning to Harry Ashmore and Ralph McGill in this letter. Because one of the things is Harry Ashmore wanted to do something with education in the new administration, but could never get it in with Kennedy because remember, he was Adlai Stevenson's speechwriter. So, but I did find letters too where, and I found a couple of things that went up through the Justice Department where Bill was talking about the CIA operatives that were in South Florida were actually being instigators rather than, they were causing problems rather than solving problems. And it's interesting because the growth of the CIA operation in South Florida was directed by Bobby Kennedy, who, with Operation Mongoose, which was the growing of that presence. And here he was sending letters up to them saying, y'all are instigating things rather than, it's causing problems here. So I think one of the things with Kennedy, with President Kennedy, was that Bill sort of gave it to him straight and said, this is really I don't know what people are telling you, but this is really what's happening on the ground. Because the Bay of Pigs had been so disastrous. And again, most of that was planned and done under Nixon and Dulles. And it was an inherited situation, yet Kennedy had trusted the generals and the Joint Chiefs of Staff to inform him and say, yes, let's go through with this. Whereas Bill on the ground was like, I don't know that this is the best way to deal with Castro. He had written letters previously after the revolution. He had an opportunity to interview Castro for 2 hours. They kind of got drunk together and smoked cigars together in a Washington hotel room. And so he got a private audience, a 2-hour interview with Castro, and actually writes a letter to Castro afterwards and says, as a friend of the Cuban people, I do want to tell you, I'm not sure that you understand democracy well enough to institute democracy. Because, he basically tells Castro, I don't know that you have the goods to lead a nation. It's all fine and good to be a revolutionary, but and he even writes the same to Nixon, Vice President Nixon at the time, and says, here's what you need to know about him. And Nixon's answer to him is like, yes, I'm sure he'll cause problems at some point, but we'll keep him contained, kind of like, sort of like brushing off Bill. So during the 1960 campaign, Bill actually was part of a group of people who had been helping write Latin American policy platforms and submitted it to both the GOP and the Democratic Party. And only the Democratic Party paid attention to it. And also had been pushing pretty heavily on civil rights and was very discouraged that neither party had really embraced what he and the other Southern, the camp followers that they called themselves, the camp followers, had put forth that they needed to consider. So I think he developed this reputation with Kennedy that he's just straightforward. Kennedy also had an affinity for journalists. He considered being a journalist. So he had an affinity for journalists. And I think he probably recognized a little of the same spirit that Bobby had as a scrapper in Bill, you know, to some extent.